So what if I told you that the most famous, world-changing economic theory of the 20th century wasn't actually discovered by the legendary John Maynard Keynes?
Right, which is what everybody's taught in school.
Exactly. Like, what if the actual blueprint for modern macroeconomics, the literal mechanical logic of how global capitalism operates, was sketched out years earlier by a college dropout from Poland, a guy who didn't even have a degree in economics?
It really remains one of the quietest, most profound plot twists in academic history.
Yeah.
We're looking at a man who approached the global economy, this incredibly complex, intimidating machine, and realized that the dominant experts of his era were, well, they were essentially reading the wrong technical manual.
Yeah, totally. So today we are jumping into a deep dive on the sources you provided about Michał Kalecki. He's a figure widely regarded in academic circles as the co-discoverer of modern macroeconomics.
Mm.
And the mission for this deep dive is to unpack how Kalecki used this strict outsider's perspective to map the hidden mechanics of the market.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because his diagnostic frameworks, which he developed, almost a century ago, they offer this really striking lens for things you deal with today. Things like algorithmic price gouging or the structural constraints of the gig economy.
Right, the stuff impacting all of us right now. And I do want to be crystal clear from the jump here. The source material spans Kalecki's analysis of both capitalist and socialist economic models.
Yes, absolutely.
We are presenting his theoretical framework impartially. So we're treating his observations of class and power strictly as the analytical mechanics he intended them to be. We're not here endorsing any specific political ideology today.
No, not at all. We're just looking at the plumbing.
Yet.
And his perspective was forged in a very, very specific furnace. To understand his models, you really have to look at the environment that produced them.
Right.
So Kalecki was born in 1899 in Udo, Poland. And during that period, Udo was known as the Polish Manchester.
Wow.
Yeah, it functioned as this massive, rapidly industrializing textile hub. So it was an environment characterized by just severe structural inequality.
Yeah.
And these really violent boom and bust cycles.
And his proximity to that volatility wasn't just, reading about it in a textbook. It was deeply personal for him.
Extremely personal. His father ran a small textile spinning workshop that went completely bankrupt.
Right. And from the sources, that failure wasn't the result of poor business management, right?
No, not at all. It was just a casualty of broader regional economic contractions.
Like getting swept away in a macro storm.
Exactly. And that direct experience fundamentally severed Kalecki from the prevailing neoclassical economic orthodoxy of his time. Because mainstream economists, operating in these pristine academic environments in Cambridge or Vienna.
The ivory towers.
Right, the ivory towers, they largely viewed the market as a self-equilibrating system. So in their models, crises were just temporary frictions.
But Kalecki, having literally watched macroeconomic forces decimate his own family's livelihood, he internalized early on that the economy doesn't possess any inherent magical mechanism for, restoring balance.
Right. The devastation was systemic. It wasn't a glitch.
And this skepticism really compounded when he entered higher education. Because in 1917, he enrolled at the Warsaw Polytechnic, but not to study economics or market psychology.
No.
He studied civil engineering.
Yes.
He was learning fluid dynamics, structural stress, load-bearing math, and the crazy part is he never even finished that degree.
Yeah, he was drafted.
Right. Drafted into military service during the Polish-Soviet War. His family faced complete financial ruin, and he was forced to drop out in 1923.
It's a rough start.
Very. So he transitions into financial journalism, basically tasked with analyzing raw commodity markets and corporate balance sheets.
Which, ironically, that became his greatest analytical advantage.
Really? How so?
Well, by avoiding formal indoctrination into that neoclassical economic theory, he just never adopted their assumptions. He didn't view the market as this collection of perfectly rational actors maximizing utility in a psychological vacuum. He applied his engineering background.
So he's looking at it like a literal hydrodynamic model.
Exactly.
That's such a great analogy. Where traditional economists debated the invisible hand or consumer psychology, Kalecki was basically drafting a plumbing schematic.
Yes, looking strictly at the macroeconomic pipes.
Where does the capital flow? Where are the pressure valves? Which social class controls the blockages? It's a framework built entirely on the mechanical laws of accumulation and distribution.
And that engineering precision defined his entire career. Later in his life, while he was advising the British government during World War II, his colleagues at Oxford would take literally days running complex statistical models to predict the impact of a tax policy.
Right.
Kalecki would famously calculate the macroeconomic effects in minutes on the back of a used envelope.
Wait, really? Just on an envelope?
Just on an envelope. It shocked his colleagues. He bypassed all the theoretical noise and just isolated the structural flows of demand.
That is wild. And when you analyze the economy as a closed hydrodynamic system like that, you eventually hit his most counterintuitive mathematical proof. Which brings us to Kalecki's profit equation.
Page one.
In its most distilled form, the accounting identity states, and I love this quote, workers spend what they get, but capitalists get what they spend.
Yeah, it's a brilliant deduction derived strictly from macro accounting. So in Kalecki's simplified two-class model, the working class has a marginal propensity to consume of virtually 100%.
Meaning they have to spend everything they make just to live.
Exactly. They must spend their wages on food, housing, basic survival. Therefore, their wages immediately flow back into the corporate sector as revenue.
Okay.
So the aggregate profit of the business sector cannot come from the workers, because the workers are really returning the wages they were just paid.
Okay, wait, I need to unpack this second half of the identity, though, because my own microeconomic intuition is screaming against it.
Sure, go ahead.
If we look at the capitalist class, say, a group of billionaires or factory owners, if they aggressively spend their capital on luxury consumption, like buying a fleet of luxury yachts or building massive estates, their individual bank accounts go down. They are bleeding cash.
Right.
So it sounds like a paradox. How does spending out of their own reserves enrich their class?
I get it. It sounds completely backward. But the paradox dissolves when you shift from individual microaccounting to macroaccounting. The source material uses a localized cafeteria model to illustrate this.
Okay, lay it on me.
Basically, if a factory owner spends millions constructing a new luxury estate, that capital doesn't just evaporate. Where does it go?
To the builders, I guess.
Exactly. It flows into the ledgers of the construction firms, the raw material suppliers, the luxury goods manufacturers. And who owns all of those firms?
Other capitalists.
Exactly. They all belong to the same capitalist class. At the aggregate macroeconomic level, the spending of one capitalist literally becomes the profit of another.
Oh, wow. So the class as a whole captures its own expenditure. It stays in their plumbing.
Precisely. Unlike workers, whose consumption is strictly constrained by their wages, the capitalist class dictates its own profits. If they collectively decide to hoard their capital and halt investment, demand collapses, sales plummet, and their collective profits vanish. They create their own profit volume by spending.
That structural reality completely breaks the neoclassical assumption of, perfect competition, which assumes thousands of firms are engaging in a price war until profit margins are driven to zero.
Yeah, Kalecki looked at the industrial conglomerates around him and recognized that perfect competition was just an academic fantasy. It doesn't exist. Instead, he formulated the degree of monopoly.
Right, because he argued that prices in the real world aren't determined by an invisible auction aligning marginal costs with marginal utility. Prices are administered. A firm calculates its prime costs, like raw materials and direct labor, and then they just apply a markup.
And the critical insight here isn't just that markups exist. That's obvious to anyone who has ever bought a cup of coffee.
Right. A latte at a multinational chain costs way more than at a local shop.
Exactly.
Right.
Not because the barista is better, but because of what dictates the size of that markup. Kalecki posited that the markup is a direct quantification of a firm's monopoly power.
It's all about brand power and market concentration.
Yeah, barriers to entry, the ability to protect pricing. The greater the degree of monopoly, the higher the markup, which mathematically shifts a larger share of the national income away from wages and directly into corporate profits.
And that redistribution creates a systemic vulnerability, because if the capitalist class captures an ever-increasing share of the wealth through these monopoly markups, they have to continuously reinvest that wealth to keep the hydrodynamic system flowing, right?
Yeah.
If they stop reinvesting, the whole economy stalls.
Which leads directly to the mechanical failure of the system, the business cycle.
Right, because if aggregate profit depends on continuous investment, you might wonder, why don't they just spend infinitely? Why do we have economic booms and busts at all?
Yeah, if it works so well, why stop? And Kalecki found the answer in human fear and the simple concept of time. He identified two specific mechanical governors that prevent infinite expansion.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is the principle of increasing risk. Now, neoclassical models suggest that as long as the expected return on investment is higher than the interest rate, a firm will just borrow and expand forever.
Right.
But Kalecki noted this ignores the existential threat of scale.
It's the reality of leverage, like the analogy in the source is about the delivery driver.
Yes, exactly.
If an independent delivery driver uses their own savings to buy a second motorcycle, their risk is strictly limited to that cash. But if they borrow money to buy 5 motorcycles, the math changes completely.
Yep.
A tiny dip in delivery demand doesn't just mean less profit, it means losing your house.
It's corporate annihilation. The marginal risk of borrowing increases with every dollar leveraged. So that fear of risk acts as a hard ceiling on expansion, regardless of consumer demand.
Okay, so feared is the first governor. What's the second?
The second governor is the business cycle lag, which is purely a function of time. There's this inescapable delay between the decision to invest and the actual delivery of those goods.
Oh, this is the pizza party analogy from the sources.
It is, yeah. It sounds so basic, but it perfectly mirrors heavy industry.
So imagine you're hosting a party. At 8 p.m., your guests are starving, so you order 10 pizzas, but there's a 40-minute delivery time.
Right.
During that lag, the environment shifts. Guests get tired and leave, or they fill up on chips. By the time the pizzas finally arrives at 8:40, the demand has completely evaporated.
And that right there is the mechanical oscillator of the macroeconomy. Industrialists see high demand, so they order new factories to be built. Building those factories employs workers, injects money into the system, and fuels a boom.
But it takes time to build a factory.
Exactly. And by the time they are operational and flood the market with new products, the market's capacity to absorb those goods has already peaked. We go rapidly from undercapacity to overcapacity. The industrialists panic, freeze all new orders, and the system crashes into a bust.
So booms and busts are entirely mechanical. And by the 1940s, Kalecki had mathematically proven this. And both he and Keynes figured out that governments possess the plumbing tools to fix it.
Yeah. By stepping in to spend money and run deficits, the government could theoretically keep the economy running perfectly in a state of permanent full employment.
So if they knew how to fix it, why didn't governments just do that all the time? Why wouldn't we want a perfect economy?
And here is where Kalecki introduces the raw element of political power. In 1943, he published this brilliant essay analyzing this exact paradox. He hypothesized that business elites would actively oppose permanent full employment.
Which sounds completely backwards.
Yeah.
If government spending guarantees consumer demand, which guarantees corporate profits, why would the elite lobby against their own profit?
Because Kalecki argued that business leaders understand the social consequences of full employment are way more threatening to them than a temporary loss of profit.
Oh, interesting.
His analysis centered on what he called the fear of the sack.
The fear of getting fired.
Exactly. Under normal conditions, the threat of unemployment is the primary disciplinary mechanism in the workplace.
Here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. Think about your own workplace. When unemployment is high, people accept unpaid overtime or terrible conditions because they're terrified of being replaced.
Yep, they're compliant out of necessity.
But when unemployment is really low, suddenly people feel empowered to ask for raises, better hours, or structural changes. The fear is gone.
You nailed it. Kalecki theorized that if workers no longer fear losing their jobs, factory discipline breaks down. The absolute authority of the managerial class erodes. They lose their social prestige.
So what do the elites do?
Kalecki suggested they will pressure governments to cut spending and create artificial recessions, usually under the guise of balancing the budget. Yeah, purely to discipline the working class.
So the economy is deliberately cooled down just to remind everyone who is in charge. He was basically saying the economy has managed to control attitude, not just efficiency.
And we should remember, this is Kalecki's hypothesis of power dynamics. But the audacity of publishing that in 1943 is staggering. And what makes his story so compelling is that his frameworks were being independently mirrored across the English Channel.
Right, because Kalecki arrived in England in 1936, only to find that John Maynard Keynes had just published the General Theory.
The book that basically launched modern macroeconomics.
Yeah. And Joan Robinson, a famous Cambridge economist in Keynes's inner circle, reads Kalecki's prior work in Polish. She realizes this unknown college dropout had reached the exact same conclusions years prior.
The destinations were identical, but the vehicles were vastly different. Keynes built his model on market psychology, investors losing their animal spirits and getting sad.
Right.
Kalecki grounded his model in aggregate accounting and class structures. Joan Robinson actually thought Kalecki's framework was superior because it didn't rely on the fantasy of perfect competition.
So how did Kalecki handle this? Did he sue for plagiarism?
This is the best part. He showed immense modesty. He never claimed plagiarism. He just quietly noted to his colleagues, quote, "I discovered it for socialism, and he discovered it for capitalism."
That restraint speaks to his incredible integrity. I mean, he was immune to institutional prestige. In 1954, he resigned from a senior post at the UN to protest McCarthyism in the U.S.
Yeah, he wouldn't stand for the suppression of free inquiry, so he returned to socialist Poland.
But he didn't exactly toe the party line there either.
Not at all. He refused to act as a yes man. When the communist bureaucracy demanded unrealistic output that would crush workers, he publicly dismantled their models. He was constantly marginalized.
And his final act of defiance came in 1968. The Polish government initiated a severe state-sponsored anti-Semitic purge. Kalecki, who was Jewish, watched his colleagues get stripped of their positions, so he resigned all of his university and government posts in protest.
He severed his entire career rather than offer legitimacy to a bigoted state. And he endured relentless smears from the state-run press in his final years.
But his engineering detachment remained intact. I love his famously dry quote about those media attacks. He said, "I feel like a man who has been run over by a garbage truck. The problem isn't just the hit, but the smell it leaves behind."
It's the ultimate objective analysis of a nightmare. And while his refusal to play politics might have cost him mainstream fame during his life, today, his plumbing blueprints are diagnosing the 21st century economy perfectly.
Absolutely. You only need to look at the post-2020 inflation spike. Orthodox models blame the money supply or supply chain delays, but they couldn't explain the simultaneous explosion in record corporate profit margins.
And that is where Kalecki's markup theory perfectly explains greedflation. Supply chains did fracture, but megacorporations used that crisis as an excuse to raise prices far beyond their actual costs, just because their degree of monopoly allowed them to.
And we see his theories applied to the modern gig economy, too. Kalecki said income distribution is inversely proportional to a firm's monopoly power. Today, algorithms at companies like Uber or Amazon act as the ultimate monopolies.
They are absolute monopolies, a single dominant buyer of labor.
Right, the algorithm is the ultimate markup. It dictates the value of human labor second by second, finding the lowest possible wage a worker will accept.
And we also see his warnings about unspent profits playing out with stock buybacks. We've had a decade of low interest rates and massive corporate cash hoarding.
And instead of investing in real productive capacity, they just buy back their own stock to artificially inflate their value.
Exactly, diverting capital into financial engineering. The plumbing is clogged exactly where his model said it would be.
So, as a listener, what is the ultimate takeaway here? Economics isn't just a science of neutral numbers. As Kalecki joked, it's often the science of confusing people with numbers.
Yeah, it's very true.
It's really the study of invisible forces, power, class, and time. Every time you see a streaming service hike its prices or read about a central bank trying to cool down the job market, you are watching Kalecki's theories play out in real time.
You're watching the valves of the system being turned.
Exactly. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to ponder that builds on his 1943 essay. We are entering an age where artificial intelligence promises just unprecedented economic productivity. The machinery of capitalism is about to become unimaginably efficient.
It really is.
But through Kalecki's lens, we have to ask, will this new AI wealth be used to guarantee a comfortable life and full employment for everyone? Or will it simply be used as the ultimate technological tool to maintain the discipline, the precarity, and the power of the elites?
The plumbing is getting a massive upgrade. But the real question is, who controls the valves?
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.
No te vayas del video antes de comentar, suscribirte o darle like. Recuerda que estamos en TikTok, Instagram y YouTube.